Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Natasha. So I'm going to take a little bit different approach than Paul and Brenda, and mine won't be necessarily like an outlook today, but sort of a quick introduction to something that I've been working on to help our producers make better decisions, particularly around soil health. So if we haven't met yet, I have been in the UW system for about 14 months now. And so I've been around the state, but my work primarily relates to economics of soil health and water quality and the water quality challenges that we do have in the state. And so something I have run into sort of in the first 14 months is that oftentimes if folks think that you have a PhD in economics, that you ultimately are an expert in how to make a profit. And sometimes if I get asked by the agronomists or folks with an agronomy background, they want to bring in an economist to figure out how to make some practice profitable. I have bad news. Unfortunately, that is not my expertise and not what I am an expert in. I grew up on a farm, a small farm in Kansas, and if I knew had some secret how to make profit on in agriculture on a farm better than anyone else, I probably would be doing that instead of working at UW. I would say ultimately, though, what I actually do more of and spend most of my time studying is the economics of decisions. Economics is the study of decision making, and economics intrinsically is a social science, and so we study society and how humans make behavior and make decisions and their behavioral changes. And as it relates to agriculture, that involves a lot of things that are not just profit. That it does include profit, don't get me wrong. For sure, we want the decisions that farmers are making need to be profitable, but there are also other factors that we need to include. And when we're talking to farmers, we have to also consider. Particularly, there's both factors of short run and long run profit. Risk is which I'm going to talk about and dive into a little bit later today. There's also knowledge barriers, and that's why I think we as UW Extension exists in the first place is to communicate and educate about what these practices are doing in our operation. And then lastly, too, traditions and values, right? Like we make decisions based on the way they've been done for hundreds of years or decades, and so it's hard to sometimes switch to make those decisions in the first place. And so, ultimately, when it comes down to it, a lot of these factors are rarely absolute. They're rarely certain. And they're when we're making the decisions, when our farmers are making the decisions, some of these things are hard to know. And so we can make guesses about and projections about what the payoffs of those would be, but ultimately those things come with risk and come with uncertainty. And so thinking about soil health in particular, if you have been a part of conversations from UW's perspective, there's a lot of things that are soil health practices, things like cover crops and no-till in particular, and they do to affect our operations and our land. Just a few of those things are preventing erosion, suppressing weeds. If you have heard Rodrigo Worley talk about this, there's also these impacts on cash crop yields, nitrogen retention in the soil and building up soil carbon, right? And so ultimately, when we make a decision about implementing some of these soil health practices in our operations, we have to incorporate all of these and all of these things potential have dollar values attached to them. And so we want to be able to incorporate all of those benefits and costs. And so how typically that might look from an economist perspective and traditionally is we look at a partial budget. We go and input the values into a spreadsheet, and then at the end, it gives us sort of a dollar value of what we might expect. This was something I made shortly after I arrived last year, so the corn prices are a little bit more optimistic than they would be for this year. But essentially, what you can come down to in this scenario, if you trust these numbers, is a single value on what your yield effect would be for implementing cover crops. So in this case, without cost share, you would need a 3%, 3.7% yield increase from cover crops in order for them to pay off ultimately. You can get assistance with cost share and makes the changes that calculus a little bit. But really what we land on, right, is a single number value. But rarely in agriculture do we make decisions that are as predictable and as certain as something like this in a spreadsheet. And so the downsides of this is that we fail to capture sort of all of those intrinsic values that I sort of mentioned when it comes to implementing some of these cover crops. And ultimately too, and this is what we're going to dive into more, is that if you hear decisions around cover crops or soil health practices, there's this conversation about resilience, right? That when we implement these practices, our soil, our crops are more resilient to drought, are more resilient to prevent plant if in excess wet years. And so there's a factor of limiting costs and reducing costs, but also there's this factor of reducing risks. And this has been shown in some economic research. And so what I imagine in my vision for my program and for this tool in particular is to use some of the data that we have on our agricultural operations or from our field trials in the state to better help our producers make decisions. And we have this in a lot of ways in our day-to-day lives. We can think about things that are very salient to us right now with the election. I mentioned I'm from Kansas, so I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan. So on a typical Sunday afternoon, I'm looking at like what's the Chiefs win probability based on whether or not they run or pass or get an interception or get a touchdown. Those things are ultimately updating in real time, right? And so my vision and my goal here is that we can help our farmers make some of the same decisions based on this sort of statistics-driven approach. And so I'm going to exit out of, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second and go to the web browser where this is at, and just walk us through two quick examples of the tool that I have been making around this. So very simply, there's a few decisions that you would need to make as a user to work with this tool. But ultimately, what it's getting at is providing input and providing a perspective that's more than just a single number value, but it allows you to assess sort of the risks of implementing some of these practices. And ultimately, with this tool, it's specifically implementing cover crops and no-till in your operation. So it's a really like discrete yes or no sort of trade-off implementing this. And so there's a few capabilities in this. I want to preface that this is very preliminary. This is a work in progress. This is version 1. This is the first time I'm sort of sharing this with the public in a way that could be usable for you. And I'll share a link at the end of this that you can go and mess around with this yourself. But first, so step 1 is to select your sort of cash crop that would come after this practice. And in the baseline scenario, I'm going to select corn. We're going to input sort of our market price for corn, which is relatively close for today. So we'll say that it's $4.10 per bushel. You can implement then in step 3 your baseline inputs. So how many pounds of fertilizer are you requiring for your corn? How much end credit are you getting from manure? What are you paying per acre for herbicide and fungicide? What are you paying for your tillage costs typically if you were a conventional till prior to this? And what's your expected yield? So those are sort of your baseline inputs. Those things you may know from your past cropping history if you're a farmer. And then the last piece of this, and this is the important part of this, is what do you expect to change in your operation from implementing some of these practices? Specifically here, we're thinking about implementing cover crops. And so we're going to assume that comes at a cost of $20 per acre. We're going to say that you get a 40-pound nitrogen credit, which is pretty purposefully generous. And I'll come back to why that is in a second. We're going to say that you're going to reduce those herbicide costs so that your cover crops, that biomass that you're building up, suppresses those weeds, and you don't need as many applications of herbicide as you would have. So it's a 41% reduction in herbicide costs. You're going to have a positive cover crop termination cost associated with this. You're going to have less tillage costs because you're now implementing no-till. And then we're going to also assume that you have sort of this yield drag that's associated with cover crops of 5%. And then all together with that, if you're getting cost share assistance from NRCS or from your producer-led watershed group, maybe you get $20 per acre bonus. And some folks would also have forage value that maybe could incorporate on this. And so ultimately what this leads to is that you can compare based on these simulations and based on some randomness that happens with weather, you can compare your outcomes in your conventional system, which is represented by the yellow curve, and then the soil health system, which what I'm going to call is represented by the green curve. Because we have such low cash crop prices for corn, neither of these systems are providing much positive net return. But we do see a few instances, right, where our soil health system is above zero. And the second piece of this is we can go look at, based on all of these inputs, what percent of the time are we breaking even? And in this case, it's something like 2% of the time under these conditions we're breaking even with 410 price per bushel of corn. And I think what Paul said, we needed something like 498 in his presentation for on average. The second scenario I want to walk through, I'm going to go to a different tab now, and is look at the soybean. And I'm going to do this just really quickly. Is what we can look at is if we impose a little bit more conservative estimates on what our cover crop are going to do for our soybeans. And so we're going to have very similar baseline requirements for soybeans, although we're not applying fertilizer. But let's go to our changes and let's assume that we actually are changing 0%. We have no benefits for nitrogen credits. We have no benefits for our herbicide costs. We have no benefits for our tillage system, and we have no change to our yields. But what we do have is we have a cost share assistance that is exactly equal to the costs of implementing these cover crops in the first place. So basically what we're saying is that all of our costs of implementing this system are completely offset. There's no agronomic, no soil health benefits of actually implementing these practices and on average, but what there is this sort of risk reducing effect. So the mean of this distribution is exactly the same. But when we go look at our break-even analysis, we actually are getting a little bit of like more often our soil health system is breaking even than our conventional system. It's very slight, but I specifically had constructed this so that it was really close. But ultimately, you can get at the fact that you can capture and visualize some of this risk reduction of implementing some of these practices. So I'm going to conclude by just saying that this is very much a work in progress. I certainly would appreciate feedback on this. This is something that I am actively working on, and it's just been like me and a grad student that have been doing this. I don't have a big team of data scientists that are plugging this into the background, and so I want to know would make this most useful and most useful for decision makers. So there's a link to this. There is a link to this decision tool. It's not public yet, but I wanted to share it to you all. You can go in and play around, create your own scenarios, and then I would certainly welcome feedback and appreciate feedback on items that would make this more useful. So that's where I'll conclude for today.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff.